Okay, our next speaker is Scott Zona, who's an author, a botanist, and like Janice, also an educator. He holds BS and MS degrees in botany and horticulture from the University of Florida, and he also has a PhD degree in botany from California Botanic Garden and Claremont Graduate University in California. He has explored and written about plants in Florida, California, Central America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and also Madagascar. In 2022, Scott wrote A Gardener's Guide to Botany. And Scott, did you bring some copies of the book? Yeah, he has some copies of that book in case you didn't buy it when he sold it here a few years ago. And last year, he was co-author of a book on the palm trees of New Guinea. Scott is co-editor of Palms, which is the journal of the International Palm Society. He currently works for NC State University as the manager of online classes and the Plant Toolbox. And the Plant Toolbox is a database of photographs and descriptions of some 4,600 plants that grow in and around North Carolina. Scott is also a research collaborator at the North Carolina Botanical Garden Arboretum in Chapel Hill. He's here today to tell us about Charles Darwin and the research and observation that Charles Darwin did after he wrote On the Origin of Species, in which he looked at a lot of plants and wrote about them. So that's what Scott will be talking about. So please welcome Scott Zona.
Thank you very much, Bobby, for that introduction. Very kind. We're here to talk today about the botanical contributions of Charles Darwin. We're here for Darwin's birthday, which is also, of course, the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. I suspect these two men were aware of each other. Certainly, Darwin would have been aware of the American presidency, and Lincoln was an avid reader and would have been aware of Darwin, who was a best-selling author at the time. But I have no indication that Lincoln read any of Darwin's books. Both of these men have their correspondence now all databased and searchable online. I went through both of them, found no evidence that they ever corresponded with each other. But it's nice to be able to celebrate two great thinkers in one day. As far as we know, Lincoln never contributed much to botany, but Charles Darwin did. And so we're going to talk about Charles Darwin. And of course, we can't talk about Darwin without talking about evolution by natural selection. And that was surely his greatest contribution to biology in general. Now, Darwin did not come up with the idea of evolution. That evolution was very much on the minds of 18th century biologists. And they were aware of fossils of animals that looked slightly different than the living examples of those animals. So there was obvious there had been change, at least the biologists thought so, but no one could come up with a mechanism. A mechanism change was the real sticking point. Theologians, of course, didn't believe in change at all, that the creation was made just as God made it, and there was no change from that. And so when Darwin started thinking about evolution by natural selection and thinking about evolution in general, he realized how this whole idea could really shake society to its foundations. In fact, when he started realizing that species did evolve and they must evolve, he wrote to his friend Joseph Hooker at Kew, a botanist at Kew, and was telling Hooker about his realization that species evolve. And he says, it is like confessing a murder. I mean, he realized that it was that significant and that, astonishing to be able to think about species changing. So Darwin's ideas of evolution by natural selection, of course, were informed by his almost 5 years on the Beagle. He was on the Beagle not as the ship's naturalist, but as the companion for Captain Fitzroy, who suffered what was called melancholy at the time, probably would call it depression today, and realized that 5 years without anyone to talk to of his education and social standing would be too much. So he requested that he have a gentleman on board that he could talk to and have dinner with. And Darwin was that man Darwin, of course, was educated and of that class. It was also informed by, evolution was also informed by the idea that Earth was much older than the 5,000 years or so that was being talked about at the time. Charles Lyell wrote a book on geology that much influenced Darwin and really gave us that concept of geological time of millions of years, not just thousands. And it was also informed by the idea of Thomas Malthus that organisms were producing way more offspring than could possibly survive, way more than they needed to just kind of maintain their population. And so those things were in Charles Darwin's mind as he was thinking about the origin of species, which he wrote some years after the voyage of the Beagle. But while he was thinking about it, in 1858, a letter came to him from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was at that time in one of the islands in what is now Indonesia, that essentially Wallace wrote him asking him to present this paper to the Linnean Society, and it was in fact an outline of the origin of evolution by natural selection. Darwin showed the letter to his friends, Joseph Hooker among them, and they encouraged him to write a similar piece, and the two pieces then would be presented together at a joint presentation in 1858 at the Linnean Society, and that's what he did. He presented essentially an abstract of the origin of species, and of course this whole thing lit a fire under him, and he got the book published the following year in 1859, and it was an immediate bestseller. And we give both Darwin and Wallace credit for coming up with this idea. And it's really remarkable that they did it without any knowledge of genes or genetics. Mendel's laws of genetics weren't published until 1866, and they were published in an obscure journal. Nobody ever saw them until they were rediscovered in the 1900s and realized that they were significant work. And of course, DNA was not known to be the carrier of the genetic code until 1953. So doing all of this without having any idea of what genes are about or what heredity is about is pretty remarkable. I tend to favor Darwin a little bit when I think about evolution by natural selection, because Wallace in his later life got into seances and spirituality, which, is a little unscientific. And he also did not believe that natural selection applied to humans. He thought that humans were apart from the natural world. So I tend to favor Darwin a little bit on this. All right, so that covers the biggie, evolution by natural selection. But let's talk about Darwin the botanist. Darwin never thought of himself as a botanist. His training was in geology. And he thought of himself as a geologist first, and then kind of an overall naturalist. He had training in botany while he was a student at Cambridge from his friend and mentor, John Stevens Henslow, who was a well-known botanist there at Cambridge. And that training, although it didn't turn him into a botanist, it did give him the tools for studying botany, and that is, it taught him how to make specimens. When he was in the field, he could make specimens, pressed and dried specimens, that could then be given to a botanist who could then assess and identify the plant. He sent, during the voyage of the Beagle, he collected plants all over the world, including the Galapagos, and had the good sense to send them to Kew. He became good friends with Joseph Hooker, who was a botanist at Kew. Joseph Hooker's father, William Hooker, was the founder of Kew and the director of Kew initially. Joseph succeeded his father in 1865. And it was William Hooker, the father, that described this species. This is Berberis darwinii, a shrub from Chile and Argentina. And it was a shrub that Darwin saw and collected and brought back to Kew. And William then described the species based on the collections that Darwin made. Kew was then and still is today one of the most significant botanical gardens and significant collections of dried plants that there is. They now hold something like 7 million specimens. They're not the largest herbarium in the world, but they're one of the largest. And it is, as far as I'm concerned, sort of the center of the universe for botany. This is one of the older wings. I'm told that it's based on 19th century prison designs that the levels there, and you can see there are bays, and those bays would have been cells, of course, in prison, but in the herbarium, and this is the wing, this is wing C, I think. In this wing, the bays are defined by those tall floor-to-ceiling cabinets you see there, and those cabinets are what hold the dried pressed specimens. And you can see there's lots and lots of cabinets. And then in between the cabinets in the bays, there's a window, natural light, microscope, working table, counter height cabinets there to form a working surface. It is such a delight to work there in one of those bays and to study plants and to look at specimens. And such a treat to walk up and down those spiral staircases and know that so many great botanists have gone there before. Unfortunately, at the times I'm at Kew, the palms are now stored in one of the basements of one of the newer wings, so I don't get to sit in those nice places anymore. But it is a treat to visit Kew and to see their collections. And you can see a lot of their collections now online. The one on the left is from the Galapagos Islands. This is a specimen that Darwin collected and sent it to William Hooker. William Hooker described it as a new species, Yeageria gracilis. It's in the sunflower family. But there on the right is the specimen of Berberis darwinii. This is the actual specimen that Darwin collected and sent to Hooker, and Hooker then used to describe the new species. So that continuity is still there. You can still see the actual specimens that Darwin collected. Well, shortly after the voyage of the Beagle, about 3 years after, he got married and moved to the village of Down. Down was a little, at the time, a little rural village, well outside southeast of London, well outside of London, and that suited Charles Darwin just fine. He didn't want to be in the city where he would be have a constant stream of visitors and be invited to parties and have to go to events. He didn't want that. He wanted the quiet and solitude of being out in the country. Down nowadays has been totally engulfed by Greater London, the suburban sprawl of London. So now it's not outside of London at all, really. And you can see at Down House, he grew plants. These, of course, are modern plants, but those beds existed, and he presumably grew plants that interested him. He also added, I think, 3 greenhouses to the property, greenhouses then that would allow him to study plants. And I think it was at Down House that Darwin actually became a botanist, because after he published Origin, he published, was it 10 or 11 more books? 7 of those were all about plants. So if that doesn't make him a botanist, I don't know what does. And the first of those books after Origin was this book. This is on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects. It was a deep dive into orchid morphology and anatomy. And part of that reason was he was using these studies to support his ideas of evolution by natural selection. So he was studying orchids to see how, for example, how the petals were modified and to make the lip. You know, orchids have that showy lip. That's just a modified petal. Well, that lip is not something new. It's just a modification of an existing, pre-existing organ. He made observations of orchids that he grew in his greenhouses, not tropical orchids really, but just local orchids. And he made observations of the little terrestrial orchids that grew around Down and still grow, of course, in England. And one of the most important orchids he studied, this is one of these little terrestrial orchids, it's really no more than about 12 inches tall, is the pyramid orchid, Anacamptis pyramidalis. And this is an orchid that was fairly common, or at least was common around Down at the time. And his observations, his studies established, one, that orchids needed to be pollinated to make seeds. That was not terribly recognized as a fact back then, but he established that. He established that outcrossing led to better fruit and seed production. That outcrossing meaning pollination from a genetically distinct individual rather than self-pollinating. So outcrossing led to better and healthier seed and fruit production. And he also established the whole idea of lock and key pollination, where the flower is the lock and the pollinator is the key, and the pollinator has to fit right into that lock in a very specific way in order to affect pollination. If it doesn't fit, then it doesn't do the pollination. So it was this book and Darwin's careful observations that really legitimized pollination ecology as a field of study. It really put it on the map. Now, I mentioned Darwin didn't grow exotic tropical orchids in his greenhouses, but he did have access through his friends at Kew to the orchids that they grew. And one of them that they grew, or at least they grew several, is the genus Catasetum. And Catasetum is a tropical American orchid. It's Catasetum and its relatives. And he called this group the most marvelous of all orchids, which is pretty strong stuff because orchids in general are pretty marvelous. So he thought this one was the most marvelous. And it's because of that trigger mechanism. And if you look in the center of the picture of the flower there on the left, this is a hybrid. I couldn't find a good species picture, but the hybrid shows it. That little trigger mechanism, that hair-like structure that hangs down from the column, that's the trigger. Okay, go on YouTube, look up Catasetum, and there's lots of great videos of the pollination mechanisms. What happens is when a bee or a finger touches that trigger, it shoots the pollinia out. And pollinia, remember, orchids don't have granular pollen, they have pollinia. It's in little masses. And it shoots it out and sticks it to the bee. And it's one of the fastest movements in the plant kingdom. It's fascinating. Darwin loved to study movement in plant, and so this fascinated him. It's worth seeing. So seek out some videos of Catasetum pollination. Let me just go on then to talk about Angraecum sesquipedale. So then when we think about orchids and Darwin, this is often the orchid people think about. In fact, this is sometimes called Darwin's orchid. And this orchid was, I think, instrumental in promoting the idea of coevolution between flowers and insects, and their pollinators. So, and when I say coevolution, I mean the flower causes change, evolutionary change in the insect, and the insect causes evolutionary change in the flower. And that was brought about because of this very long nectar spur on the back of the orchid. And you can see it in this painting. And that nectar spur is essentially just a very long, narrow, deep pocket in the lip of the orchid. The lip is, remember, is just a modified petal. And so if we look at Angraecum and its relatives, all have these really nice nectar spurs. And you can see it there on the left, Orangus, that long arching nectar spur. If you look at Angraecum eburneum in the center photo there, if you look at the flowers that are facing away from the camera, you can see that long green nectar spur hanging down directly behind them. And then over there on the right, Jumelia, that long structure hanging down from the flower, that's the nectar spur. So that's a deep, deep pocket. And in the bottom of that, there's nectar secreting tissue there, and it secretes nectar, and the nectar accumulates down in the bottom of that spur. Now, Darwin knew all about nectar spurs. The pyramid orchid has a little short nectar spur, so he knew what nectar spurs are all about. But when he saw Angraecum sesquipedale, he was quite astonished. Sesquipedale means 1.5 feet. The nectar spur is not really 1.5 feet long. I think orchid botanists, like fishermen, tend to exaggerate. I was going to say something else, but I'm going to keep it clean. So average size is about 13 inches long. So not quite 1.5 feet, but significant length on that nectar spur. So the orchid was first named and described from Madagascar in 1822. First flowered in Britain in 1857, and it was, remember, it was in the collection of wealthy orchid collectors. Orchids were expensive to buy, they were expensive to keep, they had to be in heated greenhouses, so really only the wealthy people could afford it. And it was when one of these plants flowered, the flowers were cut and sent to Darwin in January of 1862, and I put the month there because that's significant. His book on the fertilization of orchids came out in May of 1862 and includes his famous prediction. So clearly this orchid so astonished Darwin, in fact, he wrote to Joseph Hooker, "Good heavens, what insect can suck it?" So astonished Darwin that he, I don't know if he put it in while the book was still in the proof stage or if it was still in the manuscript stage, but he put in this famous prediction that in Madagascar, there must be moths with proboscides capable of extension of a length between 10 and 11 inches. In other words, long enough to get down to the nectar in that long nectar spur. And oddly enough, that prediction didn't generate a lot of pushback at the time, but it was noted. And in 1903, a moth was discovered with the proboscis long enough that could pollinate the orchid, and it was named, the subspecies was named subspecies predicta in honor of this prediction. And there's the plate on the left there is from the article that I cite there, worth seeking out. I think it's open access, so anyone can get it online. A really interesting article about Darwin and this prediction and this orchid. And then on the right is a photo from iNaturalist, and you can see this is a big moth. It's not a particularly colorful moth, but it's a big moth. And in the plate on the left, you can see the proboscis extended there. And if you look at that, it's almost 12 inches long, that proboscis. So it's a pretty impressive moth. And what impresses me is that the moth has to uncurl that mouth part and aim it right into the nectar spur while it's still 12 inches away from the flower. So that, I think, is some pretty fancy flying. When was it? In 2003, I think it was. I thought I wrote it here. 2003, I was in Madagascar collecting palms. In St. Luce, which is a little village down in the southeastern part of Madagascar, we were there in a forest that is on deep sand. It's a low canopy forest. It reminds me a lot of sandpine scrub in Florida. Deep sand, low canopy, kind of dry, not humid rainforest. And we were walking along looking for this palm. I was with colleagues from Madagascar and Kew, and we happened to walk past Angraecum sesquipedale in full bloom, growing actually kind of at the base of a tree with its roots down in the leaf litter. I was so dumbstruck. I only had the presence of mind to take one photo, and I'm glad I even did that. But it was certainly one of the highlights of the career. Had I seen the moth fly in and pollinate, I probably would have dropped dead right then and there. Actually, the actual evidence of the moth visiting this orchid was not obtained until the late 1990s. Photographs and video evidence of the moth pollinating the flower didn't come until even later than that. It was 2007. So it's quite amazing that this relationship between the orchid and the moth has been a focus of interest in biology for over 100 years. All right, let's go on. Darwin was producing plant books almost every 3 years. So in 1865, he published this, and this is probably the most readable of his plant books, partly because it's short. It actually started out as a journal article in the Journal of the Linnean Society, but he was encouraged to publish it separately as a book, and it is a fun book to read. It's readable. Darwin's literary style is not as, well, I wouldn't call it breezy. It's pretty dense, but this is one of his more readable books, and it's in 4 parts about the different different ways that plants climb. And it was inspired by just a short little note written by Asa Gray, who was a botanist in Harvard, who was looking at the way tendrils of plants in the cucumber family, wasn't a cucumber, but in the family, how those tendrils grab a hold of things. And we call that thigmotropism, where something grows towards something that it's touching. And that little note, and it really is just couple of paragraphs, inspired Darwin to take up a study of vines and climbing plants. And he actually looked very carefully at the tendrils in the cucurbit family, or the cucumber family. And I'll just tell you, Asa Gray got it wrong. Gray thought that the cells of the tendril on the inner side in contact with the support, those cells were contracting, when in fact, Darwin got it right. It's the cells on the outside of the curving tendril that are expanding and enlarging. It causes the curve. I had a video here to show twining vine. We're just going to skip it because I don't think I can get it to work. So Darwin didn't have the luxury of time-lapse photography or video. So how did he study vines? Well, he had an ingenious method. He took a glass hemisphere, it might have been just a simple glass bowl, that he put over the top of a growing plant. And again, he was growing these plants in his greenhouses. And he would, every hour or so, he would take an observation and he'd put a little dot of ink on the bowl, the glass bowl, of where the growing tip of that vine was. And he'd follow it across the day, and you can see he'd end up with this tracing, which sort of vaguely you can see a spiral there. And that spiral shows how the vine is twining around something. Now, strangely enough, and Darwin noted this, most vines all grow with a right-handed spiral. And in fact, Robert Orndorff from Berkeley in 1991 analyzed vines, a large number of different vines from all over the world, and came up with 90% of the vines have that right-handed spiral. Darwin noted this. He didn't have an explanation for it. Orndorff didn't have an explanation either. We still don't know why so many vines have that right-handed spiral and so few have the left-handed spiral. Now, the few that do are actually kind of so noteworthy, you can use it actually as like a species character if you're trying to key out plants. And in fact, our 2 weedy invasive wisterias, the Japanese wisteria has the left-handed spiral, the Chinese wisteria has a right-handed spiral. And it has nothing to do with what hemisphere they're growing in or anything like that. It's just something genetic in the plant. And if you try to take the vine apart and try to put it the other way, it's not happy. It'll grow the right way. So, and nobody knows why that is the case. All right, well, we're here in the southeastern United States, an epicenter for carnivorous plants. So I had to talk about Darwin and his book on insectivorous plants. It's a fairly large book, and he devotes 11 chapters, more than half of the book, to one plant, the Drosera rotundifolia, and I'll come back to that in a minute. He did devote a chapter to Dionea, the Venus flytrap. He devoted a chapter to Aldrovanda, which is a aquatic plant from Europe and Asia that's related to Venus flytrap. And then he did one chapter for the following 3, the Drosophilum, which is from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, Ravicula, which is South Africa, and Biblis, which is Australia. All of those have sticky hairs on the leaves similar to Drosera. Strangely enough, he mentions Nepenthes only once in passing, something that Joseph Hooker told him about. Hooker was growing them, they were growing them at Kew, but obviously Darwin didn't grow any at his greenhouse. And Sarracenia, our native pitcher plants, didn't get a mention at all, which I find astonishing. And the more I thought about it, I kept thinking, why wouldn't he talk about Sarracenia? And I think it was probably because nobody knew they were carnivorous at the time. In fact, even Venus flytrap, when it was first found, was not thought to be carnivorous. It was thought that it was offering shelter to the little insects that were crawling on the leaves. So it's quite possible, and I don't know this for a fact, but it's quite possible that Sarracenia was just not understood at that time as being carnivorous. Darlingtonia, which is the California Pacific Northwest pitcher plant, that didn't get a mention. So I think they were just not understood. And really, even Drosera was not fully understood to be carnivorous, and that's why he devotes 11 chapters to Drosera. This is Drosera retendifolia. It's all throughout the Northern Hemisphere. It grows in England. It grows here in North Carolina. And as you know, from probably you all have grown sundews, when an insect lands on that sticky tentacles, they all tend to move in and engulf the insect in more of the sticky droplets. And then eventually the leaf will actually fold in on itself. And that, again, movement fascinated Darwin, so he was interested in what these plants were doing and what was happening to these insects that were getting stuck on these plants. He collected plants locally, grew them in his greenhouse. By this time, his son Francis was old enough to help him with the experiments, and he then started subjecting these long-suffering Drosera to all kinds of experiments in pH, temperature. He even hooked them up with electrical currents. And then he started feeding them. And oh my goodness, it's clear he just went through the house and just grabbed anything he could find to throw at these things. He started out, sensibly enough with little blocks of gelatin, and he cut them in perfect little cubes. He'd put them on the Drosera, and he'd look at them an hour or two or three later, and he could see that those nice sharp edges on the gelatin cube were now eroded and rounded. And he rightly concluded that this was digestion happening, that there were enzymes that were digesting whatever was in gelatin. And then bone, chicken, cartilage, sheep, roast meat, he didn't specify. And what my favorite, poison from the fang of a living adder. I mean, was poor Francis forced to hold the snake while Charles observed the poison? Anyways, he threw literally everything at these plants. And what he realized is that the leaves would, if he put a piece of glass on the leaf, it might bend a little bit, but it would quickly kind of reset, and it wasn't interested in glass. But if it was something like gelatin or roast meat, the tentacles would move in, and the leaf would fold in on itself, and it would stay that way for several days. And and it was through these experiments that Darwin concluded it was proteins or nitrogen-containing compounds that these plants were getting from the trapped insects. And they weren't getting it from nicotine or turpentine or anything else, but they were getting it from the insects. And this, is common knowledge today, but at that time was brand new science. All right, I'm going to wrap this up quickly here. As I've said, Darwin loved movement. His penultimate book was The Power of Movement in Plants. And this, I confess, I've not read this one. It's dense, 574 pages. Even Darwin complained when he had to go through the proofs before it was published that it was heavy going. But he wrote to de Candolle, who was a very famous botanist in Geneva, that he succeeded in showing that the more important great classes of movements are due to the modifications of kind of movement common to all plants, even in their youth. And again, this is showing that these things that are happening in plants are not new things that are just suddenly being created out of nowhere. They're modification of existing things, existing movements, existing behaviors, existing structures. And again, I had a great video of a little helianthus seedling doing what is called circumnutation. It does traces this helical path as it grows. You can go on YouTube, that's where I found it, and you can find lots of videos of plants doing circumnutation. And that is the movement that is common to all these things that he was studying, and that's what he was writing about. He was very interested in thermonasty, which is the name we give to the movement of plants according to temperature. And you're probably familiar with seeing this on rhododendrons. Rhododendrons will, in the wintertime, droop like that. Some other plants will do it too. Daphne does that. Who is it that called Daphne redneck rhododendron? I think that's that works. Was that you, Tony? Darwin thought that it had to do with turgor pressure in the petiole, and he was right on that count. But what Darwin didn't realize, is that the curvature of the blade, the way it curves around itself, that's a separate movement, and that has nothing to do with turgor pressure. So Darwin didn't quite get that one. But he was fascinated by, like I say, all kinds of movements. Well, I couldn't have put this talk together without the complete works of Charles Darwin online. This is a fabulous website. If you're interested in anything that Darwin wrote, you can get PDFs of it, all free. You can download it to your Kindle or whatever. All his books, all his papers, all the book reviews of his books, manuscripts. There's even Darwin's library. So the books that Darwin was reading are there. Obituaries, just everything Darwin is there, and it's all free and wonderful, and it's a great resource. So I'm taking advice now from my friend and former colleague at Fairchild, Dr. Carl Lewis. I mentioned to him once I didn't have the right slide, and he said, well, just show puppies. Everybody likes to see puppies. And so that's what I'm showing here. And I wanted a picture to kind of wrap up what Charles Darwin and plants was all about. And I think it's curiosity. If I had to have one word, it is Darwin's intense curiosity in the natural world. He was intensely curious. He wanted to have these plants in front of him so he could observe them over time. So I think we can take a page from Charles Darwin's book, grow our plants, observe them daily, and we will surely learn something from them. So thank you, and happy Darwin Day. The question, for the benefit of the people on Zoom, the question is, why did Darwin assume that the pollinator of Angraecum sesquipedale, the orchid, was a moth and not some other creature? I think he knew, well, he did know of the moths in England that had the fairly long proboscis, the hawk moths. We have them here, of course, as well. So he knew that moths had mouth parts longer than butterflies. And the pyramid orchid that he studied so intensely, which has a little small nectar spur, that was pollinated by moths. So I think moths were a logical choice for him. Yeah. The question is, the lip of the orchid is so labile, modifiable, and if you look at orchids, they all have slightly different lips, and that's a modified petal. And the question is, why is that one petal so easily modified? Is it, controlled by a single little bit of DNA that can be easily mutated? I have no idea to answer that question. Sorry. The comment is that Wallace's book, The Malay Archipelago, is a much easier and better and more entertaining read than Origin of Species, and I tend to agree. But the Malay Archipelago is not really putting forth his ideas of natural selection. Yeah. The comment of his book on barnacles is one of his, it's actually, he wrote that before he wrote any of his plant books. And it's a monograph of botanicals. And yeah, it's pure taxonomy. It's pretty heavy going, but there's, I understand, a book about the book on barnacles that is entertaining. Yeah. Any other questions? That's it? Okay, thank you.
So our first speaker today is giving a short bonus talk is Janice Swab. She has an undergraduate degree in science education from Appalachian State University and a master's and doctoral degree from the University of South Carolina in Columbia. Janice has had a distinguished career teaching locally at Meredith College and also at North Carolina State University. But she's also taught botany and biology under Fulbright teaching fellowships beginning in the 1970s in many of the countries of the former Soviet Union. She's also been a teacher exchange program in several universities in China and also in African countries as well as India. Over many decades, Janice has visited, I believe, all of the places that Charles Darwin stopped in his 5-year voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle in 1831 to 1836. But she's also visited some of the places that Alfred Russel Wallace studied in the Malay Archipelago, which is north of Australia. And he independently came up with theory of evolution shortly before Darwin did. Janice has been to the Galapagos Islands many times, taking students from Meredith College and other places. Her most recent trip was in 2023, when she spent 5 weeks volunteering at the Galapagos Conservancy and working on the tortoise rearing project on Santa Cruz Island. She's here this morning to answer the question, should you travel to the Galapagos Islands? Please welcome Janice Swab.
Bobby hates me because he has given me an invitation to speak for 15 minutes on something that should have at least 2 hours. And I have not taken students but once, actually, in 1976, when the islands looked much as they did when Darwin was there in 1835. Let's begin. It's 1835, and the Bishop of Panama, a certain Tomas de Berlanga, is traveling along the west coast of South America with a small group of people. They have been blown off course 600 miles. They went into the Pacific and landed on a place that no one had known. It was not on any map. It had not been seen by European white people, so it didn't exist. And so they realized that they were somewhere that was very, very unusual. And there are 13 main islands. They didn't find out very much about it because they were only happy to find them because there might be water, but they didn't find any, and that has been subsequently the case. Then, as soon as it was known, of course, the word spread, and the sealers and the whalers got there and saw that there was food to be had from the islands. Those huge tortoises, they were really good, and they could pile them up in the hold of the ship and have food for a year, fresh, good tortoise food for a year. So that became a stop for whalers and sealers. And it looked most likely just like this, the particular view here. And now you can see that same view, but there will always be some kind of ship in it. It's nearly impossible not to see a ship. But 300 years after it was, quote, discovered, there were no indigenous people. The 8 to 12 million years that these islands had evolved, they are volcanic. The flora and fauna had evolved without the presence until 1535 of any of the most invasive species, that is the human species. And so when it was known, as I say, everybody got excited and stopped there for food. And so by the time that Darwin got there, 300 years later to the year 1835, almost all the tortoises that were easy to get around the landing spots had already been hunted out. And the whalers had begun to use the tortoises for oil. All they did was to cut the shell off the living tortoise, render the oil, and got rid of thousands and thousands of tortoises. So I'm going to just mention a few of the reasons why these islands have been such an abused area of the world, and why we should not continue to abuse them. Yes, I went for 5 weeks to volunteer with the Galapagos Conservancy. This is the T-shirt that they had us wear every day while we were doing our work to rather advertise what they're doing. But without the Galapagos Conservancy, there would not be tortoises for tourists to go see today. I want to make that point right off the bat. So we're going to start on Santa Cruz, San Cristobal. There's an airport there, so you can land there. And you have to fight the seals and the fur seals and the sea lions now, because they have been protected and they have come back. They were almost extinct by the time Darwin got there. He didn't even mention fur seals because he didn't see any. But today, unfortunately, there is a research station. This is the idea of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it is a place where they take students to do research and that sort of thing. But the toll that this one institution takes on the resources of the Galapagos is something that we could discuss, but we don't have time. When I was there in 76 with students, you got into a little boat and you went toward the island that you happened to be visiting, and you got out and jumped up on the rock as best you could. Somebody helped you to keep you from falling out of the boat and into the water. Today, of course, that is unthinkable. There are a number of places where you can land on these, on some of the 13 islands. 4 islands are actually now invaded by humans. And the country of Ecuador, which is the Galapagos Islands are part of Ecuador, made this into the whole thing into a national park in the early part of the 1900s, because it was very obvious what was happening then it was mostly the sailors and the whalers and the sealers, but 97% of the Galapagos Islands are a national park. You wouldn't know it from the traffic and from the way it's built up and that kind of thing. There are a few, I'm just giving you some examples. I only have 15 minutes. There's a Galapagos cotton that you can see, which is indigenous. There is the so-called sunflower tree. It is in the sunflower family, but a tree, Scalacia, and these are some of the flowers. There are cacti, and in one of them, the lava cactus, does just that. It manages to get a hold when there's a little bit of soil on the lava, and you can see little patches of it. But one story I must relate very quickly is the story of what happened when the sailors decided that they had to have some other food source since they were running out of tortoises. So they introduced goats, not only onto Isabella, but the worst story is that of Isabella, which you, of course, see here. There are 5 volcanoes on Isabella, and the tortoises kind of congregate in the areas around those volcanoes. The age of the islands progresses as you go toward South America, toward the east. So these are the youngest of the Galapagos Islands, and so, as you know, there are volcanoes still spouting over there. I want to give our attention to Isabella because that's where the goats were first introduced. And there were 3 goats. This was in the 1500s. By the time people really started paying attention, there were over 100,000 at least. That's what they could count at the time. So it was a problem, but not only goats, but ships had, in the days of the 15, 16, 1700s, were overrun with rats. There were these big black rats, and they would pull their boats out of the water to rid them of the rats, and guess where the rats went? And multiplied and became a huge problem. By the 1800s and into the 1900s, there were people who wanted to live there. If you read stories, you're going to know that some mighty strange people lived on the Galapagos Islands. And but what did they bring? They brought with them their cats and their dogs and horses and donkeys and pigs. These are all animals that can destroy these unsuspecting Galapagos creatures. And so I'm going to go forward with the goat story because by the 1900s, there were at least, about the late 1900s, there were at least 500,000 goats on this one island of Isabella. So they called in helicopters and sharpshooters from New Zealand. They had some experience with getting rid of animals on the ground. And they shot goats. And in 1 year, they shot more than 100,000. And this is just Isabella. And we're making progress. It's a long story. I don't have time to go into it. But they eventually, over a period of 7 years, with pulling out all the stops they had, rid the Isabella from the goats, and it costs millions. It costs millions of dollars. Just a few animals that you can see that you won't see anywhere else in the world is the penguin, or the little penguins that go as far as the equator. Only penguins that go that far. I'm running completely out of time. Just going to show you a few things. This is today. The tour companies are thick on the ground in Santa Cruz. That's where you will definitely go if you go to the Galapagos Islands and you see some of these tree cacti that you really don't see anywhere else. As you go down Charles Darwin Avenue, it's the avenue you go down when you get out of your ship, is the Conservancy Education Center where I worked. And everybody came in wanting to see a tortoise. Well, we didn't have any tortoises, any living ones, but we did have a wooden carving, and tried to educate people about the islands. Right across is a fine jewelry store. You wouldn't believe the number of things there are to buy, and they're all expensive. Especially this jewelry by Ariana. And you can eat, and for $5 you can get a lunch that's pretty good. The birds and the seals and animals are waiting for the fishing boats to come in. Until 1800, fishing was unbelievable. Then, as more and more fishing occurred, little by little, the fish became a more rare commodity, especially the sharks, because they were taken by Asians for shark fin soup. You take the shark out, you cut the fins off, you throw the shark back, and many invertebrates. Everything's good. Charles Darwin here, the Galapagos store. We know it was Darwin's favorite chocolates. You enter the national park, and this is just to remind you that tortoises are still people's favorites. I took this picture in 1976. That's the reason it's so discolored. And it has a kind of a helmet shell. They decided that they would try to repopulate these islands with tortoises. So the Darwin Research Station took eggs, incubated them in great numbers, thousands, and had the whole setup of keeping them at the right temperature and all that. And this is what results. You have to keep the tortoises 5 years, because if you put them out in their environment less than 5 years, they just don't make it. There are just too many predators out there. So one of the things that we did was to cut up the food, and then you feed the tortoises. These are the larger ones, of course, that have been there for many years for reasons that I don't have time to go into. But I will show you one tortoise that no one else will see unless you volunteer in the Galapagos. And that's from Fernandina. This is Fernanda, a female they found down in a ravine. She had lived for, they can't tell really how long, but she's probably 100 years old. Very small. They're trying to help her with her good health, so maybe she could reproduce, and maybe this tortoise type from Fernandina could be healthy and produce offspring again. This is Lonesome George. If you know anything about the Galapagos, you've heard of Lonesome George. He is the type of tortoise that had, this is his taxidermied remains. He had a saddle-like front on his shell, and that reminded people of the Spanish saddles, Galapagos, and that's the way the Galapagos got their name. They were first called by the people who, quote, discovered the Encantados. They were enchanted islands, but that didn't stick. This is just to remind you of the fishing, and this is to remind you of the number of trash pieces, big, small, all manner of trash that they pull out just to show you in this particular exhibit. It's amazing. This is where I lived in the national park, and this is a cactus that I saw blooming, but it was always. It looked like it had just bloomed, and I found out that it bloomed right before daylight, so I went out before daylight. I'll show you the second thing that you won't see anywhere else, and that is the waved albatross nesting site. You can't even go close now, but when I was there in 76, you could walk right through them, take pictures, watch them do their thing, and right now, they're using some of this area to try to revegetate through a program called Galapagos Verde 2050. By 2050, they want to have a more green Galapagos. This then is the Santa Cruz that you will never see today. That's what I saw in 76. Today, we've gone up to on the only road. You can see what it's like, but there was no road in 76. We were looking for tree ferns, and I think we found them. We're not sure. But now today, there's also farming and coffee growing, and all the water that you drink as a tourist is coming into the islands by these huge carboys, by the millions. It takes a lot of energy to get them there from the continent, and the trash that you see in that truck is taken out by the tons and burned on the outside of the city, where, of course, no one is going to have a problem with air pollution. If there are no cars, private cars, bicycles and scooters, but that white truck that you see back there, well, come on. That white truck that you see back there is a taxi. All the white trucks are taxis because that's the only conveyance that you can have. So I'm telling you, because I'm out of time, I'm telling you that if you want to see a tortoise in its natural environment, you can go to the Seychelles because there are tortoises living there, and they invite tourists because it's not touristed at all. And in the Aldabra Atoll, you can buy a T-shirt that says that you have been to the Aldabra Atoll and you have seen a tortoise or several tortoises, and they still let you get close to them, although you don't touch them or anything like that. But my plea to you is support the Charles Darwin Foundation, support the Galapagos Conservancy, and stay home and give your money, or if you must see a tortoise, go to the Seychelles.